Welcome back to the Kingsway podcast.
We did not say that right.
You threw me off. You're like the interrupting cow.
Well, okay.
Moo.
Here's what happened. You used to say, "Welcome back to the Kingsway podcast," and I'd go, "Welcome."
Yep.
But that's like episode 100 and on.
Yep.
We've had 2+ years of that. Before that, we would both try to say "Welcome back to the Kingsway podcast" in unison.
That's true.
So I was going back through because of that episode 200 and just looking back through whatever, just like seeing some random episodes, and I saw us do that, and I was like, I need to do that.
You need to do it again?
Yeah.
Well, we messed it up.
I don't want to bring it back forever, but at least for this episode.
Well, I got to say a quick shout out to Jody, because Jody had a reconstructive knee surgery, and he pulled me aside in a very serious tone on Sunday, and he said, "I just need you to know, you and Ryan eating those hot, spicy nuts was the best therapy I could have ever had while recovering on my couch."
Yeah.
And he's like, "I laughed too hard. It hurt my knee." So
that's laughing really hard.
You're welcome. And also, I also told him that I will probably never be doing that again.
Yeah.
It was not fun afterwards.
I just message out for Jody. Your knee bone is not connected to your lung bones. So
somehow it's connected to his funny bone though. So
okay.
Yeah. That joke.
I don't remember if we had promised or when we
I
said
don't
we
either.
were going to do.
I don't even remember.
We had said we were gonna Kingsway Book Club put out our book club review episode and then talk about the new book. Two things happened. One, we started back up our series on Matthew.
Yep.
And so we're at a point in Matthew that we really need to talk about.
We do.
Secondly, N.T. Wright, that book is not that long, but it's so long.
It's not simple. Can we
It's
just be
not
really?
that should be complexly Christian.
It's called Simply Complex Christianity.
Yeah.
I'm like 3 hours into it. So I'm like 4, 5, 6 chapters. And there was a point, and I don't know, I'm listening to it. So like, I'm not trying to read it, but I am normally a person that if I'm listening to something, I don't need to listen to it twice. I can get it. Mm-hmm. I listened to something 3 times in a chapter, and I was like, wait, do I agree with, what are you even saying? Like I could not, and in my mind, I just kept going, this is not simple enough for me.
Can I get Simply Christian for Dummies? I felt that same way. I'm on chapter 8 out of 16. Anyway, so that'll be next week. Mm-hmm. But for this week, we pick back up in Matthew, and we're preaching through 24. This should come out between the first half of chapter 24 and the second half of chapter 24 on Sundays.
Yep. Which you'll get if you listen to it before the service. Actually, might be kind of helpful.
Might be helpful.
So.
But there's a lot of difficult stuff in chapter 24. And so we're going to tackle that in today's episode of Sunday Study Hall.
Sunday Study Hall. Well, Ryan, we've been preaching through Matthew now for almost 2 years, off and on.
Yep.
And here's the thing. The funny thing that happens, right, when you preach through a book, you think you've read everything. You think you know what's in the book, especially a gospel book. And I think that's what's one of my favorite things about going through an entire book like this is you run into sections that you're like, oh no, that's in there. I forgot.
Yeah.
Or oh my gosh, I don't know if I ever read this in like its context. And let me just be real. If I can be open, which I think I can on a podcast that I have free will to choose to say yes or no. I don't know if I've ever preached on Matthew 24.
And I think you were saying you don't know if anybody here, maybe like before any of us worked here.
Since I've been here, I don't know if I've ever heard a sermon.
You've been here since 1970. Sorry.
It'll be 16 years in August. So, I think there was a challenge in that where I felt like, okay, one, if you've never read Matthew 24, let me just plant this seed real quick. It's where Jesus says some things that I think were quoted a lot, but just don't know in the context. It's where he says, not one stone will be left upon another, talking about looking at the temple and Jerusalem as a whole. And then there's this famous line in the center of the first section. That's when you see the abomination of desolation, you'll know to run. And so there's lots of things in this section. And then the end section where, nobody knows the end days, but it's like got the left behind stuff in it, where it's like one guy's plowing his field and then the other one's just gone. And one person's doing laundry and the other one's just gone. And and then, we get to this conversation where it basically turns into like conspiracy theorists and people that were building bunkers versus people that like had no clue that this was even in the Bible. And you have this huge range of wide understanding versus what they've been told versus perception versus reality. And it's way intimidating.
This is one of those chapters that for most Christians breaks your well-formed understanding of Jesus. If you are, and I mean this theologically, not politically, if you are a left-leaning Christian who finds a lot of comfort and power in the social gospel that Jesus taught, this isn't like whatever social gospel you feel like Turning Point USA is against or whatever. Why do I keep just bringing them up? Anyway, but this isn't like a political thing. This is Jesus healing people, Jesus feeding people. That's kind of stuff he did, kind of stuff he thought was important. And he did so much more of that in the accounts, in the gospel accounts, than meeting with city officials and meeting with powerful people and holding press conferences and whatever. The amount of times he's speaking in a formal setting versus like healing, feeding, loving, looking at people is pretty off balance toward looking at people.
Well, and this is a very different section, not just for that, but because of the style of the projection.
And that's the thing. So we have a context for social gospel. We have a context for community welfare. We have a context for the other side, which is like law and order, and you need to have obedience, and you need to like do what's good and right, and you need to like obey the laws and whatever. We have a context for both of those. We don't have a modern context for apocalyptic literature.
No.
That's what Matthew and Matthew's gospel, talking about Jesus, recording stuff Jesus said and did, breaks for chapter 24. And is now like a whole new genre. Jesus is making it a new genre for this one chapter. And then talking about some similar things bleeds back into normal parables and stories and whatever in 25, but talking about the same stuff in general.
Yeah, and it's wild.
So
it really is.
Nobody has a category for this. Whatever you think Jesus looks like, he stops looking like that in this part.
And I just got done preaching the first half of the chapter, and I can tell you, like, it came together great. I feel very confident in feeling like, the teaching team, and then myself, I think, obviously with God's help and the Holy Spirit, but it really felt like it was not something that left me feeling discouraged or confused. It actually made me lean into more of like, there are probably a ton of things that I don't understand that I'm fully comfortable with. And I need to lean in with a hope of understanding to how I live and what my faith needs to look like, but not leaning into like explain every detail of this because I need to know.
And we're gonna get to that even more later.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful for you as you're listening to this and listen to a talk. We're not trying to get to a place where like we're detailing, walking through every word and telling you exactly what that word means. It is far more difficult to do that than I think most people realize because of the intensity and the complexity of the way this apocalyptic literature works. It does not mean what you want it to mean. You have to go back and figure out what it actually means. And sometimes that is an answer that's in culture and time, and it's much more of a cross-pollination of the Bible than sometimes people realize.
And that's kind of something Jesus loves doing. So this is within his character and within like the grain of what he's been doing is so often in the Gospels. He has his 12 followers, his disciples. They've seen his ministry. They know what he cares about.
Yep.
And they'll be like spit at by a Samaritan and be like, Jesus, burn him.
Yeah.
And so they're expecting Jesus full of power and grace and truth to like incinerate some people. But Jesus only has harsh words for them.
Yep.
He turns around and prosecutes his own people. And so like this this big chapter, Matthew 24, and all of its apocalyptic, prophetic, whatever it's talking about, is a weird turn for people who were faithful Jews of that day, even Jesus followers, who are like, we think we know how this works. So we have the temple, we have the law,
Yep.
and Jesus is adding to that. And Jesus is going to say, actually, you won't have the temple anymore.
Yeah.
And also, I've fulfilled the law. And so you just have me.
Yep.
And is that going to be enough?
And I think that's to get to the text, you have to read the last 3 to 4 verses of chapter 23.
Yep.
Because Jesus reveals his heart there, where he's just got done talking to those leaders that you were talking about, that are the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Sanhedrin.
He has 7 woe to the scribes and Pharisees.
And he basically calls
watch
them
out.
vipers, whitewashed tombs. I mean, he does not pull punches. And at first, I think you're like, why in the world are you so angry, or why are you so frustrated? And then you get to the end of 23 and you realize it's because he's led the people astray. They have. And Jesus was trying to protect them. He wanted to be able to hold them like a hen would cover their chicks. And he's like, and I'm not going to be able to do it. And so because of that, they're choosing to walk away. So the way I picture this is like the prodigal son. He's like, I would love for you to be able to come home and be under my protection and stuff, but you've chose to walk away. Mm-hmm. And because of that, you're going to lose everything. You're going to lose everything. You're going to find yourself in a pig pen. You know what I mean? And you're not going to be able to make it home. And he's basically describing his broken heart of like what's going on. And it's not good.
Yeah. Jesus isn't excited about the destruction of the temple. He isn't excited about the death and the loss and the pain and the evil that's going to come about on the day from the Romans who are going to destroy the temple. But he says all this with a heavy heart. And you were right. The hens, like a hen, oh my gosh, let me just read it. As a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Sorry, let me back up. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
So, again, that's the setup to this section. And just to walk through this section, I don't think we're going to go verse by verse. I don't think we're going to read everything, but I do think we'll hit a couple sections. The first thing that we need to talk about, which I think is the most healthy understanding, which I talked about on Sunday, is this idea of mountaintop theology, or
like mountain range
theology. And I love once Tim Mackey taught that, you talked about it as well. But the concept of like when you see two mountains at a distance and one mountaintop is higher than the other, and the one that's higher is in the background, and the one that has a lower point is in the foreground, it's very hard to tell the distance between the two mountaintops. You know one's bigger and further, but you can't tell if they're like right next to each other or if they're miles or a great distance apart, because of the perception of it's hard to know that because you're looking at it directly on. And time seems to be that way in these sections with apocalyptic literature. You know that he's talking about something in the foreground, but you also know he's potentially talking about something that's in the far away in the background. And so you have to kind of sometimes judge which one, and the distance between the two, if you're thinking literally, can sometimes be challenging. Yeah. And so
the way human eyes work, this is maybe important for that too, is the closer you are and the closer something you're looking at, the shallower depth of field. This is also a photography, videography, camera thing. When you have a shot on something really close up, or you're looking at something really close up with your eyes, more stuff can be blurry because the depth of field, the depth of focus is really shallow.
Yep.
But when something is as far away as a mountain and you're not on that mountain, that's a long distance. So your eyes will see in focus both mountains. If they're in front of each other, overlapping, but one sticking out behind the other one, you're going to see them at the same focus. You might not even be able to tell, depending on the shadows, the time of day, where they're at. And so the way this works with apocalyptic literature and sometimes prophecy is in the Bible is that it'll often describe some real event or real thing going on. It doesn't have to be a big cataclysmic event like the destruction of the temple, but it could be like things are going to get harder on you. You're going to lose public favor, and you're going to be tempted to abdicate your faithfulness to Jesus. You're going to be tempted to sell out and just kind of go with the flow and whatever. That can be a mountain, but it's talking about some real thing.
Yes.
And then here's the hope for that real thing in the end, all the way back here, thousands of years later.
There's going to be a mountain.
Set everything right.
Yeah, there's going to be a mountain where I set everything right. Mm-hmm. And you see the confusion. It's not just us. It's not just us. We're talking about the confusion that even the disciples have. Yeah. Because the disciples, it's a privy conversation. I think that's important too to remember. This isn't a public declaration like the Sermon on the Mount. This is just them privately. It even says Jesus took the disciples privately.
Exactly. That's why the 3 verses before are important. That's him publicly to the Pharisees. Yep. And then 24 begins, Jesus left the temple and was walking away with his disciples when they came up to him. And later it describes him at the Mount of Olives. On the
Mount of Olives after he talks about the stones. And I think that's important too, because he's trying to be abundantly clear on like what is going to happen. And he's trying to make sure they get it, because he knows that what is going to occur. Because here's the other thing. Jesus is going to be crucified here in like 3 days, so like or 2 days. Like it's not far away. And in fact, 26 or 25 ends with him telling them they're going to come and get me and I'm going to die. Yeah. Like just know that. So he's trying to set them up. But the way that the disciples ask questions after Jesus starts talking about, no stone will be left on another, and you'll never see this rebuilt again. They ask 2 questions. They ask when, and then they ask when's the last day, basically. It's like, when do you come back? And it's really telling of like, so they think they're asking, I think they perceive themselves as saying, we know this is going to be at the same time. Yeah. But when does it start and when does it end? Yeah. And so they're like, okay, when's this going to start? But then when are you actually going to come back and finish it? And so in their minds, they're going like, it's one mountain. Like, how tall is this mountain? And Jesus is trying to gently tell them like, no, this is the first mountaintop. And down the line somewhere, only God knows, it's the last mountaintop. And so the first section is him describing, I think, what the disciples would think would be the end. If the temple's torn down and it perceives as Jesus or God losing, that's where God shows up and goes, just kidding, we didn't lose. And here's the angels, here's Jesus coming back, conquering the Romans, proving that that he's stronger than all their gods. But instead, it's the exact opposite. Yeah. And it's life-shattering.
It's tough because I don't know how much this is in their minds, but part of the reason they care so much about the temple is, number one, it's their connection to God. Yep. So, like, I want to look more into this in the coming years, but, like, how does prayer work if God's in one place? Like, do your prayers get heard better if you're closer? Do your prayers not get heard if you're in Siberia? Whatever. In the localized divinity, like Jesus, God is at the temple or God is at the Ark of the Covenant.
So the way that I've always heard it taught is that God's presence is everywhere. Yeah. But his special blessing or the special offering of his presence is in the Holy of Holies. It's like the garden, the only place the garden exists, right?
That's exactly where I'm going.
So like that is the only place that possibly, like, utopia could possibly be, where man and God could coexist. Yeah.
So God made us for the garden. God made us to be with him and to co-rule with him, but God's rulership is good. It leads to flourishing. It leads to good things and things doing well, not just like ruling with an iron fist or whatever. And so, like, the garden being restored would look like God being with us reliably or predictably. Yep. I know he lives over here. It's kind of like us coming back to God and saying, where are you? Like God said to us, the Adam and Eve, after we sinned in Genesis 3, where are you? Even though we kind of know. But Jesus knows that he's God. Yep. He is God walking in the cool. He is where you can predictably find God.
Yep. And the Holy Spirit is coming too. And so there's this like greater indwelling of I think God's Spirit that's been opened, because then we know this because the curtain is torn after Jesus is crucified. There's an earthquake. All this stuff is symbolism to basically say like the earth has changed. The temple is no longer the only place that God dwells. It's opened up. Jesus knows all that. I find it curious, and I was thinking about this afterwards. Here's the thing. I think before I get to what I was going to say, I want to clarify some things. One, you grew up with a history of someone telling you about this text, maybe without quoting it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like you have an understanding.
If you grew up Christian.
Yes. If you grew up in the church, you probably had a pastor tell you a certain idea of how Jesus would come back, what it would look like in the end times, or how the end of the age will look. I grew up in a church where we didn't really even talk about it. We just said, you don't need to know, just be ready. That was basically what I was taught.
And in fact, like growing up and for so long, most of the way through college, maybe half the way through college, Bible college, where you learn about the Bible and our faith and all that, I thought that there was one way to understand, finger quotes, the end times, or the big Bible scholar word, eschatology, the eschaton, the end, when God sets everything right. I thought there was one way, and either you chose to talk about it or not. And the people who talked about it were crazy, and the people who didn't talk about it were ignorant. And that's it.
That's it.
That's all there is to say about it. But it's set in stone. It's super clear.
Yep.
No, that's not true.
The thing that I said on Sunday that I need to clarify and say again here is the more you study this, Tim Mackey, great Bible scholar in charge of a large portion of what the Bible Project produces, which is probably one of the greatest achievements for biblical literacy that's ever occurred, at least
in our era.
In our era, but probably, if I'm being honest, maybe ever, because of the way that it's reached so many people, especially in the Western world at this point. But I think they have plans to expand even beyond the English language. Anyway,
they do. They're in dozens.
It's amazing how far they have taken. And his understanding of this text, he literally went, if you don't come to the conclusion of I don't know for some of this, you haven't studied it enough, because it's so particularly encased in Jewish understanding, in ancient Jewish understanding, that some of the stuff was literally feels like almost private for them. Yeah. Like it almost feels like it's like, nope, this isn't for you. Like it's just not saying that we can't figure it out or study it, it's not worth our time. There's just certain parts of this that if you grew up in Missouri, in Mount Vernon your whole life, and I started talking to you about the Red Barn eschatology, and you'd be like, what are you talking about? And then I tried to explain that all around the globe. Like they would be like, I had chickens in my Red Barn. What kind of Red Barn are you talking about?
For those of you totally lost, Red Barn was a restaurant here that had awesome pie and then changed owners.
And it's changed like 6 times. Yeah. And so since the first time that it was there to now, it's gone through.
Which is sort of like the temple.
Exactly.
It was there. It was destroyed. It was rebuilt.
Yep.
The days of Jesus are called the Second Temple period.
Yep.
And then it was destroyed, and it's never been rebuilt. That's like the second owner of Red Barn. I don't actually know who owned it at any time. I don't know.
I just mean like you would have such a hard time of getting an accurate understanding of what the Red Barn was, because you would be thinking about Old MacDonald had a farm. You would be thinking about, if you had a Red Barn in your town, you would be thinking about all this stuff.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to go and find Mount Vernon, find and then find somebody who can explain it.
Yeah.
And that's I know that's such a weird and outlier example, but I think that's the type of things that you bump into all the time. One of my favorite examples of this is in the first section here of Matthew, where 24, where Matthew inserts himself into the conversation. Yeah. And it totally makes this is like him going like, go remember about the Red Barn. Like, you know what I mean? Like, go remember what and it's in verse 15. And he says, so when you see the standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. And then he inserts this little thing right here, which I find it curious that it's red letters, but that's a whole nother discussion. Let the reader understand. Let the reader understand. Tim thinks that that's Matthew reminding his reader that you will not be able to understand this unless you probably go back and have a refresher in Daniel, what he's talking about.
The other thing it could mean, I don't know when Matthew was written, but it seems like Matthew knew what Jesus was talking about later.
Yep.
Matthew didn't write, let the reader understand, as he's pinning down Jesus' words or whatever.
No.
Because, so Jesus didn't say, let the reader understand. He's speaking in a real time, in a real place. He would say, let the hearer understand.
Yep.
So it's for Matthew's audience.
Yep.
And I don't know when Matthew was written. Honestly, let the reader understand could be a later addition to Matthew once like the temple had been destroyed. And he's like, hey, remember that thing that obviously fulfilled this? That's obviously what he's talking about. You know what I'm talking about.
So I didn't go into this on Sunday, but I think this would be a fun little caveat for us. The part of Daniel that he's talking about, the part of Daniel he's talking about is this vision that Daniel has.
Daniel 9 or 7?
I can't remember. I knew you were going to ask me that. But it's a vision that Daniel has about a giant statue that is made of different materials. And these materials are then basically broken down or destroyed in kind of a specific order. And those materials are kind of, in a very intentional way, made out of the materials that would best represent a nation. And so it's the Syrians, I believe, the Babylonians, and then the Romans. And I believe the Romans are made of clay. I could be wrong about that.
I'm looking for it. It's in Daniel 7, I think.
So,
or this is because he does the same sort of thing in 7 and in 2.
Yes, and there are several different things. That's why he doesn't say, go read Daniel this. Go read the whole thing, because he does it multiple times. And in fact, later, similarly, he quotes Isaiah 13, talking about the fall of Babylon, and uses very similar ideology and theology and imagery to talk about the end of a nation. And why that's so cool is because it's Jesus talking about he is the summation of the law and the prophets, which we did talk about, like he calls himself that. I think it's in Matthew 14. But he says all the law and the prophets are summed up in these two things, blah, blah, blah. Love God, love others. And you're thinking, wow, all of them? And then he goes on to be like, and I'm not just saying that, I know them. I know them. I know what they say. I know what they communicate. I have clarity on them. And I think that's reassuring and helpful, but also like, oh my gosh, really? He knows all of that, and it still sums up in these two thoughts? It's wild. So I guess what I mean in these moments where it's like, let the reader understand, or he quotes other prophetic verses in these descriptions, it is like giving cultural clues, but also massive inclinations to what is occurring. So
yeah, this has been talked about before.
Yep.
So yeah, Daniel 2 is the statue with the 4 or 5 like materials in it, and it's different nations represented by different whatever. But at the end, this giant meteor rock is going to come in and crush it, and it's the kingdom that God will set up that will remain forever, and nations will try to rebel, and it will crush them and whatever. That does sort of look like Christianity. Now, not as a centralized nation where the Pentagon is the temple in Jerusalem and whatever, but a grassroots nation of all peoples who are grafted in because of Jesus. And so the last empire, arguably, is like Greece or Rome or something like that, probably Rome. Rome is the big baddie. Rome is like the final boss, undefeated, harsh and whatever. Christianity destroyed Rome.
Yep.
Now, it wasn't an army of Christians marching into Rome and swinging their swords and killing everybody, but Rome was the largest world empire at the time, and Christianity infected Rome.
Yep.
That infected sounds like it's bad. I think Christianity is good. But Christianity like infiltrated Rome and started convincing all of these people to where if Rome wanted to take on Christianity, it would kill itself.
Yep.
And so over the course of time, Rome fell, but Christianity stood strong. And even to this day, the capital of Italy is Rome. Yep. And I hope I'm not wrong on this. Inside of Rome is Vatican City, a literal Christian, well, it's Catholic, but like Christian bastion, the Christian Pentagon or whatever.
Yeah.
For Catholics at least, which was the whole worldwide church in the West.
For 1,000 years.
The church in the West for 1,500 years.
Yeah, over 1,000 years.
It was all like they all talked to each other and they all got along, sort of. Anyway, but that is like a giant, like for the graffiti of Rome, who was vulgar and polytheistic, they had all these gods and all this whatever. For it to be nothing but Christianity to be vibrant right now, that's exactly like... I'm assuming.
It's wild. One of my favorite Andy Stanley sermons of all time, which I've quoted to 1,000 times, is there is a cross over the Emperor's Gate in the Colosseum, and it does not mean death, and it does not mean suffering, and it does not mean Roman power. It means the Prince of Peace. And to take even an instrument that the Romans used like that and to transform it, it's the way that Jesus does things, right? He takes the thing that the enemy would use to harm and to hurt and to steal and to kill, and he twists it and he offers life and life to the full. So here's the beauty of this text, because here's why we've had this discussion, because we just did a two-part thing with Shane.
The last 2 episodes before this one.
And they were so good. And one of the things that he talked about in there was so helpful for us understanding this, and was part of the reason why we wanted to even talk to him, because we knew we were going to bump into this. But what he says is everybody gets caught up in what are the materials in Daniel, and what are the imagery, that what does it actually mean, and what's the timetable, and what is the actual, and he's like, and what ends up happening is you talk about all of these like far off details, and you get lost in that discussion, and you miss the actual thing that Jesus was trying to teach, and all that stuff was just a setup for it. And he's like, what's so sad is that because the discussion breaks down, because we can't agree on these little things that are, they're maybe important, but not necessarily key always to completely understanding the point of what is being taught. And he said Revelation gets hijacked like that, and I think this section has been hijacked like that, especially if you go down the YouTube like rabbit hole of this section. It's pretty intense. So I tried on Sunday to kind of bring it back to what I saw was important to remember. But like, I'm curious, for that first section talking about the fall of Jerusalem, at least, we haven't gotten to the second. Like, what do you see as like the most important thing as you read this text? Like, what sticks out to you as like the key ingredients?
So Jesus is talking about the fall of the temple. This isn't within Matthew 24. You have to read the New Testament to get this picture. But the thing that Jesus and then later the Holy Spirit impresses upon people is that and John 4, the woman at the well. Right now, the Jews are right. They worship at the right temple. You Samaritans, the like half-breed Jews, the hillbilly Jews, you worship at the wrong temple. You worship on the wrong mountain. But there's coming a day when people won't worship on this mountain or that mountain, but they'll worship in spirit. And what God wants is worship in spirit and truth. God's spirit, you need to worship in spirit and truth. And the way that plays out with, okay, what is the temple then? Where can I predictably find God then? You can see it all through the book of Revelation and some other places. Talked about metaphorically, but also very real. That, and also in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, and maybe somewhere else, we are the temple of God. Now, the temple was their institution. So I don't have to think as hard, work as hard, pray as hard. I know that God's with us because the priests are doing that work off in that other place. So I can rest easy. I just need to do my part and like keep up the law and not be whatever. That's the way, at least in that day and age, that their version of Judaism worked. And what Jesus said is, your institution standing between you and God is going to crumble. And then you're going to see God face to face. Like, what are you going to have then? That's why so many times, even in later in this section, actually in 25, the Jesus utters the phrase, Jesus tells stories that are like, but I did miracles in your name and I cast out demons. And he'll say, but I never knew you. Who are you? Get out of here. And so one of the warnings, the main literal direct warning is the temple's going to be destroyed. Don't put all your hope and faith in the temple. Doesn't mean it's bad. And we even see in the book of Acts that the first Christians in Jerusalem still go to the temple. But they also have like home church at home in their new communities. But what Jesus is saying is, 1 Timothy 2:10, there's one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Like, don't put all your faith in this other thing to do the work of relating to God for you. God is going in 3 fateful chapters. God's presence, his special presence abiding in a special blessing way that we talked about earlier, is going to be released when Jesus dies and the curtain to the Holy of Holies is torn top to bottom.
Yep.
You don't have to go to an institution anymore. And so the way this plays out, I think, in our day and age is Jesus is everywhere. God is everywhere. He can be found at any place. He's not bound to any national territory or physical soil.
Yep.
He's everywhere. And so don't put your faith in a mediator. That doesn't mean don't have any Christian friends or leaders or trust in whatever. And so the ways this works out, we were having this conversation the other day, and you brought this up to me, and I'm going to take it as true because it seems true. But if you guys want to do your own research at home and figure it out and whatever, one of the main churches in the U.S. that writes music for a lot of other churches, honestly, we do a good amount of their music, and we can have an episode in the future. If you want to hear an episode about, is it okay to play music at church, lead music for public worship at church from churches you don't agree with, we could have that episode later.
Yeah.
And I'd love to talk about that. But there's a church, and they write a bunch of music, and we do some of their music. And they're a giant multi-site, multi-campus church. Every church gets the sermon from the main church streamed into it over video. And also like one of the last worship band songs, which is weird.
Yeah.
They have their own band, but then they're like, but you need to hear the real band, the one on Mount Zion.
Jeez.
That's
anyway. Tough.
So the way their church model works is that all of their other leaders and whatever pretty much just claim, we believe in the full anointing of pastor, first name, last name.
Yep.
I'm not going to name him because it doesn't matter.
Doesn't.
But they're saying that this one guy, this one human being who is not God, we believe that God has fully anointed, as in like prepared and chosen him for leading our church, and whatever he says goes. That's dangerous.
That's very
that
dangerous.
sounds like a temple that Jesus might destroy, or tell us that's going to be destroyed. The
Absolutely.
same way, the papacy for the Catholic Church. I'm not. This isn't an anti-Catholic message at all. Honestly, the papacy has only been kind of weird for like 200 years, instead of like 2,000 years. But something weird happened where at the beginning of the church, you can read in the book of Acts, there's like the authority in the church is a network of trustworthy people, not necessarily elected people, but like trustworthy people. So the apostles, which Paul has been made an apostle. He wasn't like a disciple of Jesus, but he's been made an apostle. That's some sort of leadership role. Don't really know exactly what it means. And then James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. But all the church leaders talk to each other. And if one kind of goes off the rails, they all confront that person and write him letters. And they're like, you got to stop doing that crap.
Yep.
And they have these councils to get together, all these wise spiritual people. It wasn't until Vatican I in the mid to late 1700s or early 1800s, I think, that the Pope declared for himself, or maybe it was a council, sorry. The Pope declared with a small council of people that when I sit on the special chair, I'm infallible. What I say is what God means.
Wow.
And that's very recent. And not all popes have sat on that chair very much.
Yeah.
Like not 16 hours a day or whatever. So they treat it pretty respectfully and pretty carefully. But still,
That's wild.
what if that pope is evil? What if that pope, and I'm not trying to say this to be anti-Catholic, anti-church
No,
structure
but
or
I think
authority.
we're trying to set that up. That this is this would be the struggle though that these disciples would have had. Is Jesus is basically telling you, I got to get the temple out of the way so that something new can come. That's better.
And God's already done that before. Jesus isn't doing a totally new thing. He's just taking it a step further. Where God before, you can correct me if it's in Ezekiel or maybe some other places, where he says, I'm tired of your sacrifices.
Yep.
They're an off-putting odor to me. Where they used to, God set up these sacrifices, some to get forgiveness, some to please God and just be an extension of love for God. And God's like, you have no love for me. You're just doing sacrifices. They're abhorrent to me, and I never want to see them again. Like that kind of attitude.
Yeah.
Jesus is taking it a step further. Your pomp and circumstance of being religious at the temple is disgusting to me, and I don't want to see it again.
And the thing that I think drove it home for me, because I think you're right on with all that. I think there's so much in here that attaches to our current struggle, situation, difficulty. But the thing that always I think gets overlooked the most for me is the way that Jesus isn't punishing the Jews. This isn't a punishment. This isn't him saying, oh, God's going to come down and throw it. He's actually just saying, you're not choosing to do the things that I wanted this to do.
You've talked about this before. You're in love with marriage. You're not in love with me.
Yeah. And it's like you're in love with this idea of your greatness apart from me. Like you're in love with, you think you're so set apart that you're now even set apart from me. And I think what's sad is that Jesus is watching this go down and knowing that Rome is going to come in and just wipe it out. And the struggle is they're so blind to realize that Jesus came for the Romans too.
Yeah.
And so it's like they miss the complete idea of what God is all about. Abraham's blessing, Abram's, was for the nations. And they were to be a nation that would help that plan to fruition. And now they've forgotten that. And
they've forgotten it for like 2,000 years or something like that.
And it's at this point that Jesus is basically declaring, I can't go with you there. And you're not choosing to go with me. And it's the thing that I pointed out on Sunday is like when Jesus is on the cross and one of his last things he says is, forgive them, Father. They know not what they do. And I think we hear that for ourselves, right? But the people at the site would have gone, is he's talking to the Jews or the Romans? And it's like, yes, both, Mm-hmm. And I think that's the biggest thing that they miss. And then the second thing that you and I have talked about a ton is the way that the kingdom works is not the way of the world. And so we don't demand people to change. We don't, angrily fight those that disagree with us. We would win hearts with love and kindness.
You had a great line on Sunday that I'm going to butcher as I'm trying to repeat it. That was, I don't remember the beginning of it, but like the goal of this is to stay faithful to God in allegiance and tactics.
Yep.
Allegiance, yeah. Pro God, God first, rah, rah, rah. Tactics. Read Ephesians, is it 5 or 6? Armor of God, but also the weapons of the world, spirit, prince of the power of the air. There's this whole like, our real enemy is not your neighbor. Our real enemy is the powers of evil tempting them away from God.
Yep.
Our weapons aren't the weapons of this world. They aren't swords and axes and spears. Our weapons are self-sacrifice and the gospel, the word of God, not to kill our enemies, but to win our enemies.
And I think that's the thought process too. It bleeds into the last section, because then Jesus is basically going to tell you the last mountain, which they probably are confusing again with this desolation that happens
with the temple.
But Jesus starts talking to them about the importance of being ready.
Mm-hmm.
And so he says, be steadfast in the time that's one of the hardest times that'll ever happen in your culture. But then at the end, he's like, hey, and no one really knows when this is all going to end and everything will be made right. Revelation 21-22. But you need to be ready like someone that's so prepared that if I showed up out of the blue, that I would catch you doing the right things and catch you saying and being in the right places, and you would be so ready. And uses goats and this bag of gold and all this to describe it.
I laughed harder at this section like 2 or 3 years ago than I ever have at a Bible section. This, I probably shouldn't even say this, but I was watching somebody like a comedian and like trying to like make people look dumb at a Trump rally and going around interviewing people and whatever.
Yeah.
And somebody just started quoting the sheep and the goats thing. God's going to separate the sheep and the goats. And the comedian guy is just like, which one are you? And hands the mic to her. And she's like, well, I ain't no sheep. I'm not just a dumb follower. The sheep are the good ones.
Yep.
The sheep are the ones you want to be. This is like so familiar, but so vaguely familiar in our culture.
Yep.
And it gets used. I don't want to talk about this a lot. I know you're going to talk about it on Sunday.
No. It's okay.
But it gets used for a weird purpose because, like you said, the charge, the thing Jesus asks us to do in this section is to be ready. And so a lot of the description of what to be ready for, like what's when you'll need to be ready, when that'll be tested, is 2 people will be working in a field, one will be taken, one will be left. Sheep and goats and whatever, and two people plowing at or grinding at a hand mill, one will be taken, one will be left. It'll be just like the days of Noah.
Yep.
And people hear that and they think, oh, I know how Christian end times work. I've read Left Behind. I know how that works. That's the only way that the Christian end times works. We can have a much longer discussion on this later.
And I think the point you make, I love the point that you're making because it's not what you think.
Yeah. They think the point is, I'm going to get raptured. And to be ready means to be looking out the window and counting the steps, and like you hear the thunder crack and you count the seconds and you're like, it's that far away. They think being ready is trying to decipher exactly when Jesus is going to show up again. Jesus is going to show up and set all things right. And that disagrees with Jesus.
Yep.
So the very first part of this second section of Matthew 24, verse 36, no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So when you hear like people online, people on TikTok or whatever, like prophecy experts, I've counted the days for 70 weeks of years and I figured it out, and it's going to be March 8th, Saturday, 2025. Jesus is coming back at 9:04 a.m. If there was any magic, any like law, like binding law that God is abiding by, it's that he won't come back at that moment because you know about it.
Yeah.
The point is that you don't know.
Yeah.
You can't know. So don't try to figure it out.
And I think that's what I was talking about earlier, what Shane gets so frustrated about is we get so caught up in these details and this like wanting to know this secret idea that we miss the point. Because if you read this section at the end of 24 and then you flow into 25, because the two sections are connected, we're not going to preach them that way.
There's a chapter break. It switches from 24 to 25, but that's later. That wasn't added to your Bible until like 1,000+ years after it was written.
Exactly. And so part of the intensity of this is Jesus is going to explain your posture shouldn't be crouched, waiting, looking for God to come back, or trying to figure it out like some sort of crazy conspiracy theorist with the red yarn in the basement.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be much more about you need to be ready in your heart. And he's already told you what standing firm, what being ready will look like. And that is his words and trusting in him, his commands.
And knowing him.
Yes.
So what Jesus is coming back looking for is not Mayan calendar experts.
No.
What Jesus is coming back looking for is faithful spouses. We're the bride of Christ. That's a whole other discussion for another day. Anyway, but people who love him, not just the idea of him or some vague whatever, but love him and talk to him, and people who are first responders, EMTs. Don't be crouching in the dark on your calculator trying to figure out when Jesus is coming back and not helping the people he loves.
And it even mentions that you know, when I was in prison, you brought food to me. You know,
when I was thirsty, you gave me water.
So like the idea here is that you're so in tune and in touch with Jesus that you're doing Jesus things and you don't even realize that you are literally becoming the hands and feet of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so when he comes back, he's coming back for those that are attached to him, like the vine and the branches. And so, you know, for me, this is more about how well or how much do you know Jesus. If you know Jesus, and I don't mean know about, I mean know him, like have a conversation. And I mean, this is so weird to talk about because we in the Western world, we have detached spiritualization or spiritualized things and mysticism from our religious experiences. And I know we're reading that in Simply Christian, and we're going to talk about that here next week.
Hopefully.
But I love that concept in the book because it's so important here. we think I need to read the Bible and learn the things that I need to know, so then I'll know the things, so then I'll be in the know, so that when I need to know them, then I'll be ready.
So I'll pass the multiple choice entrance exam to heaven.
Yes. And it's like, no, it's who you know. Like, do you know Jesus? Because I wouldn't care if you can memorize a verse or not, but if you have had conversations, and if you've never met Jesus or you've never had a conversation with Jesus, one of the best things you can do is open your palms in a quiet place with no one else around and go, God, I am not God. Help me to know you. Help me to experience you. Help me to know you more. And that's all it takes. That's all it takes. And then you have to, of course, follow him and live. But we already have talked about what that looks like. It's love him and love others. Like, it's really not, we want to make it all this crazy thing, and it's really not that
They want to make
complicated.
it. Okay, listen to verse 44 of chapter 24 of Matthew. So you also must be ready, just what we were talking about, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him.
Yep.
Being ready is not expecting Jesus. Being ready is loving and acting like Jesus.
And I think it's more of a cultivation of your heart and the connection with him. And it's not about getting things right, because that's the other thing I think that we didn't mention about the temple, but they had this idea, which was connected to the old covenant, that if they didn't have a temple to be in right standing with God, then how could they have a relationship with him?
Yeah.
And so they're going to have to choose to trust in Jesus and his grace. And that's why Hebrews is so important. It's one of the oldest, or one of the first texts that's written that we have, that we think was spoken and taught very quickly, within 20 years probably of Jesus dying, that talks specifically about Jesus being our high priest, but so much more, being our ultimate sacrifice, our being this go-between to make this stuff happen. And that is the connection to God. If you see him like a rope, he's the rope. You hold on to Jesus with everything you got, and you're good. That's it. That's all you got to do. And grace needs to be larger than you think. You're never going to have it all figured out. Like, this isn't about getting less sin so that God hates you less. I love what Greg Boyle says. A righteous life is a joy-filled life. If you are not finding joy, not happiness, joy in your pursuit of Jesus, you may not be doing it right. You may not be. And that's not to mean that joy is going to be the only emotion, but like freedom and wholeness and feeling known and truly loved is joy-filled life. That's faith. And so in my mind, that's what gets ripped out of this section when we're not careful. It's just to cling to the one that provides the joy that you think the thing, whether it's the temple or whatever struggles in your life right now, or whatever knowledge you think you have to have, it's not going to do it.
Yeah.
It's just not going to do it.
There's a book, I may have even said this before. There's a book I want to read because I've been so inspired by the title. It's a John Piper book.
Wow.
And the title is just God is the Gospel. Or put in another way, I'm assuming he also means this. God is the treasure. The treasure isn't comfort, power, experience, pleasure. The treasure is God himself. Yeah. Which will eclipse every other thing you think is worth more.
There's an old youth ministry test for this. I'll see if you've heard this before. And if you're listening, it's a great way to kind of figure out your heart. I want you to imagine that you wake up tomorrow morning and you're in heaven. Who are you most excited to see? And I know in this context, maybe you got that answer right. But if you said anyone other than Jesus, you have to be careful, because your heart may not be ready. You're like, oh, I want to see so-and-so, or I want to go have a conversation with da-da-da, or, oh, I want to go see. And I get it. There are probably some people in here that have some very heartbroken stories of people that deeply miss and are grieving. And I promise you, Jesus ain't going to make you wait long, and he may just bring him with him. But if you're not excited to see Jesus, to have him comfort you, it's one of my favorite scenes in Lord of the Rings is Frodo passes out on the mountain, and Samwise Gamgee, after they've gotten rid of and the eagles show up and they grab him and they take him back to Riverdale, and he wakes up, and the first one that's there is this risen wizard.
Yeah.
The white wizard that he thought was dead, that he didn't know was still alive. And he is so overjoyed that the line that comes out, you know the line I'm going to say, he said, has everything sad been made untrue?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the first line out of his mouth. And that's the thing that when you picture Jesus in heaven, that's the line I want on my lips, is the thought of like, oh my gosh, I'm with the one that can make all the sad things untrue.
Mm-hmm.
If that doesn't help you today, I think that's what you should lean into, to the one that can make all sad things untrue. That's ultimately what that last mountain's about. And it's about what Jesus is coming to do.
So feel free to
hope.
read this section, Matthew. So Matthew 24 and 25 is the Olivet Discourse. It's one cohesive section. Read it, but also keep some of these things in your back pocket, knowing that Jesus isn't hoping you'll be prepared by guessing the day or the hour, that Jesus, it's him.
We have our
He's
marching orders, and we get them straight from his lips and his mouth, and we have his spirit to empower us to do this, and a God that is more powerful than anything in this world, and ultimately will display that victory through his son.
And it's good to be discipled by people. I'm not trying to say have no accountability. Just go out in the woods and be a Christian by yourself. And real church is just fishing with you and God or whatever. It's not what I'm saying. But as much as you are discipled by and loved by other Christians and formed into the image of Jesus by other Christians, don't depend on one or one institution or one whatever, because that institution and that person's liable to collapse, liable to let Jesus down.
It's not bad to live off somebody else's manna that they've gotten from God, but if you're not going to the source on the regular, you probably won't get the stuff that God wants to give you, that everlasting water, that bread of life that he has specifically for you. And I think that's part of why the John 4 woman at the well thing is so important, that she is looking for that not from others, but from God. And he went there specifically for her, because I think that was a cry of her heart, was like, I don't know how to connect with you. I'm not allowed. And he's like, you know what? Special opportunity.
Yeah.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Better than any temple.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty special thing. And that's why Jesus says, I stand at the door and I knock. And anyone that would open, I will come in and I will meet with them. I will eat with them. I will dwell with them. So
I think that's the best summary of this is yes, be in Christian community. Yes, be a Christian accountability under Christian leaders. Also, never, ever, 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 ever trade your own relationship with God for an institution or a leader. It's never better. It's never more.
It's what God longs to bring into your life, not just to live vicariously through others. So, and that ultimately would be how you could be a part of some amazing kingdom work, but never have actually met the King himself. And that'd be my greatest fear of anybody in our church, that they would be a part of something, but never really attached to the one that ultimately can bring the greatest joy. So. Well, thanks so much for being a part of this discussion. I know for some of you, this has been an hour-long thing that you have stuck through, and maybe you even had to pause and go look at, Google some things. You're like, I have no idea what he's talking about. As always, if you think somebody would be helped by this, or it would be just a funny, encouraging thing to cause a discussion around your table, or maybe with your family or with some friends, feel free to like and share, leave a review. And as always, if you have any comments or things that would be helpful for us, or things that you need more clarity on, or you want to know more about, leave that in the comments or send us an email or get a hold of us, and we'd love to talk to you.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or anything?
Nope. I'm all out of thoughts.
Have a great and glorious day in the Lord. We'll see you later.
See you.